Imagine this, an elderly couple's tranquil evening, suddenly shattered when a man posing as an HOA officer forced his way into their home, injuring 82-year-old Evelyn Hayes. Now Mark Jennings, a career scammer, who preyed on the vulnerable elderly, figured this would be just another easy score. However, he fatally miscalculated. He hadn't counted on Arthur Hayes, Evelyn's husband, and a World War II veteran whose deeply ingrained courage and decisive action would dramatically turn the tables. And believe me, you'll want to hear how justice ultimately struck back with unexpected force. The night air hung thick with summer warmth, settling over the quiet suburban neighborhood like a heavy, humid blanket. It was the kind of deep night where even the slightest breeze seemed to have surrendered to sleep, leaving only the faint, distant hum of air conditioners to break the profound silence. Inside a modest, lovingly maintained home on Willow Drive, Evelyn Hayes slept fitfully, her breathing shallow and rhythmic. Evelyn had always been a light sleeper, a tendency that had only intensified in recent years. At 82, every creak and groan of the old house felt amplified in the enveloping darkness. But it wasn't the familiar sounds of the house settling that woke her this time. Instead, it was the sudden, blinding flash of the motion sensor light flooding the front porch. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her heart giving a quick, startled leap against her ribs. For a moment, she simply lay there, blinking against the sliver of intense brightness cutting across the hallway from beneath her bedroom door. Her mind scrambled, trying to rationalize the disturbance. A raccoon, perhaps? A stray dog? Maybe the neighbor's adventurous cat? Pushing aside the comforting weight of her quilt, she carefully swung her legs over the side of the bed. The cool wood floor met her bare feet, grounding her in the unsettling present. Moving slowly, her joints stiff, her nightgown brushing quietly against her calves, she made her way toward the small window beside the front door. She hesitated before touching the curtain, a prickling sense of unease washing over her. Something about that light felt different tonight, sharper somehow, more deliberate. Gathering her courage, Evelyn gently pulled the curtain back just a few inches and peered outside. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. There was a man on her porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark, official-looking uniform. The harsh glare of the porch light threw long, distorting shadows across his figure, making it difficult to pick out clear details. Worryingly, there was no discernible badge, no visible agency patches, only the imposing outline of a man who clearly did not belong there at this hour. Before Evelyn could even fully process the alarming sight, he stepped forward decisively and began pounding on the door with the side of his fist. The knocks were hard, angry blows that rattled the glass panes and echoed unnervingly through the otherwise silent house. HOA inspection, open up immediately, he barked, his voice sharp, impatient, and laced with authority. Evelyn's heart thudded heavily in her chest. An HOA inspection at 2:00 a.m. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years and had never ever heard of such a thing happening in the dead of night. It simply didn't make sense. A deep, primal instinct screamed at her not to open the door. And yet another voice, the one shaped by a lifetime of ingrained trust and respect for authority, pushed back insistently. What if he really was from the HOA? What if it was something genuinely urgent? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the lock. For one fragile, suspended second, she hovered there, caught between paralyzing fear and ingrained duty. The logical part of her brain screamed warnings. Stop. Call someone. Stay behind the safety of the locked door. But politeness, that unshakable southern politeness instilled in her since birth, tragically won out. With a small, fateful click, she turned the deadbolt. The door swung inward barely an inch before the man lunged forward with brutal, unexpected force. The impact knocked the breath clean from her lungs. She stumbled backward, arms flailing, as the world tilted sideways. Her foot caught the edge of the braided rug she had laid down decades ago, sending her crashing hard against the solid wooden arm of her favorite living room chair. Pain flared bright and sharp at the back of her head. The room spun in sickening, slow motion. The stranger, was already inside. His heavy boots thudded against the floor as he moved swiftly past her. Without a second glance, his focus clearly elsewhere. Evelyn tried to cry out to scream, but the wind had been knocked from her. All she could manage was to lie there stunned, hurting, and violated as her carefully kept beloved home was invaded by a man she didn't know under a title she had trusted for far too long. Outside, the peaceful neighborhood slept on, blissfully unaware that something terribly wrong was unfolding behind the Hayes' front door. You see, the man who had just forced his way into Evelyn Hayes' home was no official. He possessed no legitimate authority, carried no valid credentials, and certainly had no right to demand entry. His name was Mark Jennings, a man with a long hidden history, not of service, but of calculated deception. Mark had spent years perfecting a very specific, insidious kind of scam. It was one that required no weapons, no elaborate planning, just a clipboard, a generic dark outfit, and the brazen confidence to look like he belonged. His targets were consistently the same, the elderly. These were individuals who had spent a lifetime trusting the symbols of order, uniforms, official-sounding language, firm demands. To them, Mark presented himself as a representative of their local homeowners association, citing bogus emergency inspections, sudden fictional fines, or entirely fabricated violations. His modus operandi involved preying on confusion, exploiting the innate fear of authority, and leveraging the natural instinct of older generations not to cause trouble. A strategically raised voice here, a fleeting flash of a fake document there, a heavy, intimidating knock on the door in the vulnerable hours of the night. It was all part of his carefully constructed illusion. To Mark, these homes weren't cherished residences, they were merely easy marks, low risk, potentially high reward. A few minutes of focused intimidation could yield a pocketful of cash or easily pawned valuables, and then he would vanish back into the night long before anyone could piece together the truth of his deceit. He had successfully executed this cruel charade before, in neighboring communities, on sleepy cul-de-sacs, and within cozy retirement villages, where natural vigilance had perhaps softened into trusting acceptance. Tonight, he assumed, would be no different. As he stepped confidently across the threshold of Evelyn Hayes' home, he didn't hesitate. To him, this was just another routine inspection. He believed no one would question his presence until morning, by which point it would be far too late. He paid no attention to the cherished family photographs adorning the walls, the well-read Bible tucked neatly on the side table, or the colorful crocheted Afghan draped lovingly over the back of the couch. He simply didn't care. In Mark Jennings's cold assessment, this wasn't a home filled with memories. It was merely an opportunity ripe for exploitation. But what Mark Jennings didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that this particular house, on this particular night, was not devoid of strength. It wasn't just the vulnerable Evelyn Hayes who lived here. There was someone else, someone who had witnessed true danger firsthand, who had faced down real mortal threats on battlefields oceans away, and that someone would absolutely not stand quietly by while harm entered his home and threatened his wife. Arthur Hayes, 85 years old, awoke the instant he heard the crash from downstairs. For a split second, caught in the disorienting fog between sleep and wakefulness, he didn't fully grasp what had shattered the profound stillness of the night. But then came the sound that cut deeper than any explosion or gunfire he had heard in his long life, his wife's cry of fear. After that, there was no confusion, only immediate focused action. Arthur had lived through darker nights than this one. He had stood sentinel under hostile enemy skies, half a world away, his senses acutely trained to listen for sounds that spelled imminent danger. Those instincts, honed through years of military service and sharpened by survival, roared back to life with breathtaking clarity. In one smooth, unhurried motion, Arthur reached toward the nightstand beside his bed. His hand, though lined with the map of age, moved with practiced certainty. The cool, familiar metal of the old Colt 1911 greeted his touch, a trusted companion from years long gone by. He had kept it meticulously cleaned, oiled and ready, even after all these decades. Some habits Arthur firmly believed were meant to endure not out of lingering fear, but out of a quiet sense of responsibility. His mind snapped into sharp focus, clearer than it had felt in years. There was no tremble in his fingers, no hesitation in his breath. In 3 measured heartbeats, he was on his feet. In 3 swift seconds, he crossed the room, moved silently through the doorway, and stepped into the hallway, the substantial weapon raised and held steady in both hands. The old wood floors creaked softly under his bare feet, but Arthur paid them no mind. His entire world had narrowed to one singular overriding mission: protect Evelyn. Every cherished memory of the life they had painstakingly built together, every shared morning coffee, every chaotic family Christmas, every quiet evening spent companionably on the porch, pulsed urgently behind his eyes as he advanced deliberately toward the threat downstairs. He didn't think about his age. He didn't dwell on the potential danger to himself. He only knew with absolute certainty that someone had hurt Evelyn. And no one, no matter how bold or cruel, would be allowed to hurt her again while he drew breath. Meanwhile, downstairs, Mark Jennings rifled frantically through a desk drawer like a man acutely aware he was on borrowed time. Paper clips, scattered pens rolled onto the floor. His rough hands tore through neatly folded letters and receipts, desperately searching for anything valuable. Cash checkbooks, car keys. The soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock down the hall seemed to mark every second that slipped relentlessly away. He was so intensely focused on his illicit task, so utterly convinced of his dominance in the situation, that he didn't hear the quiet approach from behind him. But he absolutely heard the voice. "Get away from my wife." The sound of it froze the air in the room. It wasn't a shout, born of fear or panic. It was a command, sharp, thunderous, and utterly unyielding. Mark spun around instinctively, his body tensing in sudden alarm. His eyes darted toward the hallway, perhaps expecting to see a confused, frail old man fumbling for a phone or yelling empty, ineffective threats. What he saw instead quite literally stole the breath from his lungs. Arthur Hayes stood there like a figure carved from weathered granite. His frame, though softened by time, was remarkably steady, his arms lean and firm beneath the loose sleeves of his pajamas held the Colt 1911 as if it were merely a natural extension of himself. There was absolutely no shake in his hands, no flicker of hesitation in his piercing eyes. In that charged moment, the years seemed to melt away from Arthur. He wasn't just an elderly man anymore. He was a soldier again, clear-headed, disciplined, forged in the unforgiving fires of a war that had demanded the very best and the absolute bravest. Mark Jennings, instantly sensing the dangerous shift in the dynamic, opened his mouth, maybe to offer a desperate explanation, maybe to spin another lie, but the words never found their way out. Arthur's decision was already made. The first shot cracked through the tense air, swift and sharp. It caught Mark squarely in the shoulder, spinning him slightly and knocking the stolen envelope he clutched from his grasp. A heartbeat later, the second shot struck his thigh. Mark stumbled backward, his body starting to crumple as one leg gave out completely beneath him. The third round found his hand just as he reached instinctively for the edge of the coffee table, attempting to steady his failing balance. His fingers jerked open, involuntarily releasing the house keys he had taken, which clattered onto the hardwood floor with a cold, hollow sound. A fourth shot, deliberately placed, struck the wall just behind Mark, mere inches from his head. It was unequivocally not a miss. It was a stark, unambiguous message: I could have ended this differently. Arthur's expression remained unchanged. His breathing stayed steady, his posture unflinching. The final two shots rang out with the same measured, terrifying precision. By the time the echoes finally faded into the heavy silence of the living room, Mark Jennings was no longer a threat. He lay slumped near the corner of the couch, breathing hard, stunned into stillness, utterly overwhelmed by the speed and sheer decisiveness of the response he had so disastrously failed to anticipate. For several long, charged seconds, neither man moved. Arthur kept the firearm trained steadily on Mark, standing tall, his mind crystal clear. His finger now rested properly outside the trigger guard, demonstrating perfect discipline, ready but not reckless. In those intense seconds, something ancient and sacred seemed to pass between them, the unspoken understanding that the battle was decisively over. Arthur's gaze didn't waver. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The sheer authority of his presence alone filled the room. And Mark Jennings, for the very first time that night, finally realized that he had never truly been in control. Not really. His arrogance, his manipulative schemes, his deeply flawed belief that he could intimidate and overpower anyone, all of it crumbled under the quiet, formidable weight of a man who had already faced far greater dangers than anything Mark could ever conjure. In the faint distance, sirens began to wail, a growing chorus, drawing rapidly closer with every passing second. Soon, the flashing red and blue lights would spill across the neat white picket fences outside. But inside this house, justice in its most immediate form had already been served. Arthur remained exactly where he was, calm and resolute, watching over his home, guarding the woman he loved, just as he had done once before in a very different kind of war half a lifetime ago, and as he would continue to do unwaveringly for as long as he was able. Continue. The first frantic call to 911 was made less than 30 seconds after the final gunshot echoed through the house. Across the usually quiet neighborhood, lights flicked on in windows. Curtains twitched nervously as concerned residents peered out. Phones were picked up with trembling hands. Neighbors' voices, urgent sometimes, talking over one another as they tried to explain what they had heard. Gunfire, sharp, rapid shots coming from the Hayes house. In the distance, the sirens awoke the night. The sound began faintly, a low, ominous hum, against the familiar backdrop of chirping crickets, but it grew relentlessly louder, with each passing second swelling into a wailing chorus of approaching urgency. Blue and red lights began to stain the edges of the streets, dancing erratically across brick facades and the leaves of tall oak trees. Inside the Hayes home, however, time seemed to slow down, stretching into an unnerving calm after the storm. Arthur Hayes remained exactly where he had planted himself, a silent sentinel standing guard between further harm and his injured wife. The Colt 1911 was still gripped firmly, but now safely pointed toward the floor, his finger resting carefully and correctly along the side of the frame, instinctively following every safety rule he had been rigorously taught decades earlier. At his feet, Mark Jennings lay groaning softly, shifting weakly, but making absolutely no attempt to rise. The fight, if it could even be accurately called that, was long since over. Arthur's sharp eyes moved constantly, from the subdued figure of Jennings to Evelyn's still form across the room, then to the front door he knew would soon burst open. He listened intently to every small sound, the steady clicking of the grandfather clock, the labored, pained breaths of the intruder, the steadily increasing pitch of the sirens just outside. His mind remained remarkably clear. He knew precisely what would happen next. He had mentally prepared for it the very moment he squeezed the first trigger. It wasn't fear that gripped him now. It was the profound weight of responsibility, the solemn understanding that defending one's home didn't necessarily end with the last shot fired. It would only truly end when the full truth was known and understood. The sudden screech of tires against asphalt just outside snapped the final strings of tense silence. Seconds later, heavy boots pounded urgently up the front steps. Commands rang out, sharp, practiced, unmistakable. "Police, show your hands, drop your weapon." Arthur immediately complied without hesitation. Lowering the Colt carefully onto the nearby side table, he raised both hands, high palms facing out, and stepped slowly back from Jennings, saying nothing. The officers, 4 of them clad in full tactical gear, swept into the house with trained, efficient precision. Their powerful flashlights cut stark beams across the living room, instantly illuminating the chaotic scene. The elderly woman lying unconscious but breathing near the chair, the wounded man sprawled and subdued on the floor, and the old veteran standing upright, perfectly calm and fully compliant. In moments, the officers expertly surrounded Mark Jennings, securing him without any resistance. One officer then approached Arthur, his own weapon lowered once he had rapidly assessed the immediate situation. "Sir, are you injured?" he asked, his voice clipped but respectful. Arthur shook his head once. "My wife saw," he said simply, his voice steady but roughened with underlying emotion. "She needs help." Paramedics rushed in close behind the officers, their movements quick-focused and efficient. They carefully lifted Evelyn onto a stretcher, immediately checking her vital signs as they prepared her for transport. Meanwhile, a police sergeant began walking Arthur calmly through what had happened. Arthur recounted the events concisely, without embellishment or drama, the man pounding aggressively on the door, falsely claiming to be HOA, forcing his way inside, immediately attacking Evelyn, then proceeding to search through their belongings. His account was short, direct, and matched exactly what the officers could plainly see for themselves. Critically, there were no signs of forced entry by Arthur, no indication of aggressive pursuit beyond immediate defense, and absolutely no evidence of recklessness, only a clear, decisive, and immediate response to an unlawful and violent invasion of his home. Under Texas's Castle Doctrine, the law that explicitly allows homeowners to use force, including deadly force, to defend themselves against intruders within their homes. Arthur's actions were not just understandable, they were legally protected. The sergeant listened intently, then gave a firm nod, his professional expression softening slightly with understanding. "You did what you had to do, sir," he said quietly. "We'll take it from here." Arthur closed his eyes for just a second, allowing himself the first small tentative breath of relief since the nightmare had begun. but he stayed resolutely on his feet, stayed fully present until Evelyn was safely loaded into the ambulance, and Mark Jennings was cuffed, treated by paramedics for his injuries, and then carried out of the house. Only then, standing alone amid the disarray of his ransacked living room, did Arthur finally allow himself to lower his head and whisper a silent, resolute promise. Never again. Not as long as I draw breath. The flashing lights of the ambulance cut urgent paths through the dark streets as it sped toward the nearest hospital. Inside, Evelyn Hayes lay quietly, her face pale but seemingly peaceful under the watchful eyes of the paramedics. Arthur followed close behind in a police escort vehicle, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his mind relentlessly replaying every harrowing second of the ordeal. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Tests were run, thorough evaluations were made, and finally, after what felt like agonizing hours compressed into mere minutes, the results came back. Evelyn had suffered a mild concussion and several deep bruises, but thankfully, there were no fractures and no internal injuries. "She's lucky," the attending physician told Arthur frankly, "and you acted fast. That made all the difference." Arthur nodded silently, his chest tightening with a complex mixture of profound relief and lingering tension. He sat faithfully beside Evelyn's bed, gently holding her hand as she rested. Meanwhile, Mark Jennings was formally taken into custody at the local police precinct. The charges against him piled up swiftly, and seriously felony burglary assault on a senior citizen, impersonating a public official, and attempted grand larceny. There was no ambiguity this time, absolutely no chance for him to slip away unnoticed as he apparently had before. Authorities quickly uncovered a distinct pattern in Jennings's actions, definitively linking him to a string of similar crimes targeting elderly residents in nearby neighborhoods. Consequently, thanks to Arthur Hayes's swift and courageous response, a predator who had relied on fear, confusion, and the vulnerability of his victims to operate with impunity, now faced the full, unmitigated weight of the justice system. As the first light of morning crept softly through the hospital windows, Arthur remained steadfastly at Evelyn's side, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat under his fingertips a comforting reassurance. They had survived the night, and together they would see this fight through to its rightful end. The story spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By sunrise, news outlets across Austin had picked it up. By noon, it seemed to have reached every corner of the state, fueled by the compelling narrative. Grandpa shoots fake HOA imposter to save wife. Rahu veteran defends. Home exposes serial criminal. The headlines screamed across television screens and news websites, instantly painting Arthur Hayes as a living legend, a potent symbol of quiet courage in a world that often seemed to have forgotten what true bravery looked like. Reporters soon lined the sidewalks of Willow Drive, careful for the most part not to cross onto the Hayes' neatly trimmed lawn. Neighbors, who might have previously only exchanged passing nods, now stopped at the edge of the driveway to wave, shout words of encouragement, or simply leave small notes of thanks and support tucked discreetly beneath the mailbox. At the local grocery store, people recognized Arthur immediately. They approached cautiously at first, men respectfully tipping their hats, women reaching out tentatively to squeeze his hand, children staring wide-eyed at the man their parents now spoke of with open admiration. "Thank you, sir. You're a real hero. Wish we had more folks like you around." Arthur, never one for the spotlight, handled the sudden attention the only way he knew how, with quiet, unassuming humility. He would simply tip the brim of his well-worn cap, offer a small, respectful nod, and say plainly, "Just did what I had to do." There were no speeches, no grandstanding, just the solid, steady dignity of a man who believed fundamentally in duty, not for fame or reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. But beneath that modest exterior, beneath the soft-spoken words and humble smiles, burned a quiet, deep-seated pride. It wasn't pride for having used force. It wasn't pride related to the unexpected attention. Rather, it was pride for having stood up decisively when it mattered most. Pride for protecting Evelyn, the love of his life. Pride for defending the home they had painstakingly built together, piece by piece, over decades of shared life. Arthur Hayes never sought the role of hero, but sometimes real heroes don't seek the title. Sometimes they earn it simply by refusing to stand down when everything is on the line. And in the hearts and minds of those around him, neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had only heard his story, Arthur Hayes would forever be remembered not just as a man who fought back, but as a man who powerfully reminded them all what genuine courage truly looked like. The courthouse buzzed with a hushed, palpable tension the day Mark Jennings finally stood to trial. Reporters lined the hallways, while local residents filled every available bench in the relatively small courtroom, their faces a mixture of curiosity, quiet anger, and tentative hope. Arthur and Evelyn Hayes sat quietly near the front, hand in hand. Arthur wore his only dark suit, the same one reserved for family weddings and graduations, his shoes polished and shining softly under the courtroom lights. Evelyn, still recovering but gaining strength daily, leaned gently against him. When the prosecutor rose to speak, the entire room seemed to lean forward in unison, holding a collective breath. The case against Jennings was laid out with methodical precision and undeniable clarity. The prosecutor didn't need to resort to dramatics. The facts spoke volumes. Security footage from the Hayes' own porch camera clearly showed Jennings pounding on the door and then forcing his way inside. Inside the house, investigators had found fingerprints matching Jennings on drawers and cabinets he had disturbed. Even more damning, multiple other victims had bravely come forward once Jennings's face was aired on the news. Elderly couples, widows, other veterans, all recounted disturbingly similar stories, a man impersonating an HOA official, expertly using fear and confusion as his primary weapons. Mark Jennings's predatory pattern of behavior was unmistakable and undeniable. This wasn't a single moment of desperation. It was a calculated, deliberate, and repeated choice to prey specifically on the vulnerable. The defense attorney tried weakly to argue for leniency, attempting to paint Jennings as desperate or somehow misunderstood. But the jury saw the truth laid bare before them. They returned the verdict swiftly without apparent hesitation: guilty. On all counts: burglary, assault on a senior citizen impersonating a public official, attempted grand larceny. When the judge spoke the sentence aloud, 22 years significantly without the possibility of parole, there was no loud outcry, no celebratory noise. Instead, a quiet, collective ripple of profound relief seemed to move through the courtroom, like a heavy weight finally being lifted from everyone's shoulders. There were no plea bargains, no second chances offered. Justice in this case had been served, fully, fairly, and without compromise. Arthur sat very still as the verdict was read, his hand still wrapped tightly and protectively around Evelyn's. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply lowered his head for a brief moment, closed his eyes, and let the finality of it settle deep into his chest. Evelyn squeezed his hand gently in return. And for the first time in many long, difficult weeks, Arthur Hayes allowed himself to truly breathe again. The fight was definitively over, and this time, unequivocally, the good guys had won. In the days and weeks that followed, life in the quiet neighborhood of Willow Drive slowly, cautiously, began to find its familiar rhythm again. The police patrol cars stopped cruising by quite as often. Neighbors, once perhaps wary of unexpected shadows on their porches, began to leave their porch lights on again, not necessarily out of lingering fear, but more as a quiet shared gesture of community solidarity and renewed watchfulness. Inside their home, Evelyn Hayes grew stronger each day. Her bruises faded from deep purple to soft yellow, and the familiar sparkle gradually returned to her eyes. The only visible lasting mark of that terrible night was a small pale scar just above her right eyebrow, a faint, permanent reminder of how perilously close darkness had come to their doorstep. But Evelyn wore it not as a wound, but almost as a badge of quiet resilience.